In a world where corruption seems rewarded and honesty appears naive, you face a profound moral challenge, maintaining your ethical principles when surrounded by those who abandon theirs. Perhaps you're the only employee refusing to falsify reports while colleagues advance through deception, or you're the sole student adhering to academic integrity while others cheat their way to success. This creates what appears to be an impossible dilemma. Does moral duty require you to disadvantage yourself in a corrupt system? Through decades of developing the critical system in Königsberg, I discovered that this very question strikes at the heart of what makes us truly human. The categorical imperative doesn't merely suggest how we should act when it's convenient. It reveals why moral law must guide us, especially when everyone else has abandoned reason for expedience. Today, we'll explore how rational principles provide the only solid foundation for ethical action, regardless of others' choices, and why your integrity in corrupt systems serves humanity's highest calling. Chapter 1: The Universalization Test in Corrupt Systems. When surrounded by cheaters, your first rational obligation is to subject your proposed actions to the test of universal law. Ask yourself, could I will that everyone in my situation act as I'm considering acting? If you're tempted to join the corruption because everyone else does it, this maxim immediately fails the universalization test. A world where everyone cheats whenever others cheat creates a logical contradiction. The very concept of rules, contracts, and trust would collapse into meaninglessness. Consider the employee falsifying safety reports because colleagues do so without consequence. If this became universal law, the entire concept of safety regulations would self-destruct. Companies would operate on completely fabricated data, making genuine safety improvements impossible and ultimately harming the very people these reports are meant to protect. The maxim, "I will falsify reports when others do," cannot be universalized without destroying the rational foundation that makes such reports meaningful. This analysis reveals something crucial about corrupt systems: they are parasitic on the moral behavior of others. Cheaters benefit precisely because most people still follow rules. If everyone adopted their maxims, the systems they exploit would cease to function. The stock market depends on some level of honest reporting. Academic degrees have value because most students earn them legitimately. Democratic institutions function because most citizens and officials act with basic integrity. Your commitment to moral principles isn't naive idealism. It's rational recognition that these principles constitute the transcendental conditions that make human cooperation and social institutions possible. When you refuse to cheat, you're not just following arbitrary rules. You're upholding the rational foundation that enables human society to function. The corrupt may gain short-term advantages, but they undermine the very systems that create the opportunities they exploit. During my years examining the conditions of possibility for human knowledge and action, I discovered that moral principles operate as synthetic a priori judgments. They are universally valid yet provide substantive guidance for action. In corrupt environments, this means your ethical commitments aren't culturally relative preferences but rational necessities that any thinking being must acknowledge. The person who says, "I'll be honest only when others are honest," proposes a principle that destroys itself when universalized, revealing its irrationality. The universalization test also exposes the fundamental self-contradiction in corrupt behavior. Those who cheat rely on others maintaining the systems they exploit. They want the benefits of trust-based institutions while personally undermining trust. They desire the credibility that comes from operating within legitimate systems while personally acting illegitimately. This parasitic relationship proves that corruption cannot serve as a universal principle. It depends entirely on others' moral behavior for its success. When surrounded by cheaters, your first rational obligation is to subject your proposed actions to the test of universal law. Ask yourself, could I will that everyone in my situation act as I'm considering acting? If you're tempted to join the corruption because everyone else does it, this maxim immediately fails the universalization test. A world where everyone cheats whenever others cheat creates a logical contradiction. the very concept of rules, contracts, and trust would collapse into meaninglessness. Consider the employee falsifying safety reports because colleagues do so without consequence. If this became universal law, the entire concept of safety regulations would self-destruct. Companies would operate on completely fabricated data, making genuine safety improvements impossible and ultimately harming the very people these reports are meant to protect. The maxim, "I will falsify reports when others do," cannot be universalized without destroying the rational foundation that makes such reports meaningful. This analysis reveals something crucial about corrupt systems: they are parasitic on the moral behavior of others. Cheaters benefit precisely because most people still follow rules. If everyone adopted their maxims, the systems they exploit would cease to function. The stock market depends on some level of honest reporting. Academic degrees have value because most students earn them legitimately. Democratic institutions function because most citizens and officials act with basic integrity. Your commitment to moral principles isn't naive idealism. It's rational recognition that these principles constitute the transcendental conditions that make human cooperation and social institutions possible. When you refuse to cheat, you're not just following arbitrary rules, you're upholding the rational foundation that enables human society to function. The corrupt may gain short-term advantages, but they undermine the very systems that create the opportunities they exploit. During my years examining the conditions of possibility for human knowledge and action, I discovered that moral principles operate as synthetic a priori judgments. They are universally valid yet provide substantive guidance for action. In corrupt environments, this means your ethical commitments aren't culturally relative preferences but rational necessities that any thinking being must acknowledge. The person who says, "I'll be honest only when others are honest," proposes a principle that destroys itself when universalized, revealing its irrationality. The universalization test also exposes the fundamental self-contradiction in corrupt behavior. Those who cheat rely on others maintaining the systems they exploit. They want the benefits of trust-based institutions while personally undermining trust. They desire the credibility that comes from operating within legitimate systems while personally acting illegitimately. This parasitic relationship proves that corruption cannot serve as a universal principle. It depends entirely on others' moral behavior for its success. Consider the complexity this creates in professional environments. The accountant who discovers widespread financial manipulation faces enormous pressure to participate or at least remain silent. Applying the universalization test reveals that the maxim, "I will manipulate financial records when my colleagues do," leads to the complete breakdown of financial transparency. If everyone adopted this principle, investors would have no reliable information, credit markets would collapse, and the entire economic system would lose its rational foundation. Yet the challenge deepens when you recognize that your individual honesty might seem meaningless in a corrupt system. Why maintain accurate records when others falsify theirs? The universalization test provides the answer. Your action gains moral worth not from its immediate practical effect but from its conformity to principles that could govern all rational beings. You act not to single-handedly reform the system but to exercise your rational autonomy in a way that respects the dignity of all persons affected by financial decisions. This rational approach also protects you from the moral confusion that corruption creates. When ethical standards become unclear, the universalization test provides an objective criterion independent of social pressures or immediate consequences. You don't need to guess what others might do or calculate complex strategic outcomes. You simply ask whether your proposed action could serve as a universal law for all rational beings in similar circumstances. Chapter 2: Acting from Duty Despite External Consequences. The heart of moral action lies not in achieving favorable outcomes but in acting from goodwill guided by rational duty. When others cheat and seemingly prosper, you face the fundamental distinction between acting according to duty and acting from duty. The person who remains honest only when it's profitable acts according to duty by coincidence, the person who maintains integrity regardless of personal cost acts from duty and demonstrates genuine moral worth. This distinction becomes crucial in corrupt environments because external rewards consistently favor the dishonest. If you condition your moral behavior on receiving fair outcomes, you surrender your rational autonomy to circumstances beyond your control. You essentially allow the corrupt to determine your ethical standards by making their success the measure of your moral obligations. Acting from duty means recognizing that the rightness of your action stems from its conformity to universal moral law, not from its consequences in a particular corrupt system. When you refuse to falsify data, honor contracts, or maintain academic integrity while others gain advantages through deception, you exercise your capacity as a rational being to act according to principles you could will to be universal laws. Consider the researcher who maintains rigorous methodology while colleagues manipulate data to secure funding. The immediate consequence may be professional disadvantage, but the moral worth of her action lies in her commitment to truth as a universal principle. She acts from the recognition that scientific progress depends on honest inquiry, regardless of what corrupt colleagues might temporarily achieve through deception. This isn't passive acceptance of unfairness but active assertion of human dignity. You refuse to let corrupt systems transform you into merely another instrument of deception. Instead, you exercise the rational autonomy that elevates you above animal nature, the capacity to act according to principles rather than mere inclination or environmental pressure. The challenge intensifies when corruption becomes institutionalized. In organizations where dishonest behavior is not only tolerated but rewarded, maintaining ethical standards requires constant vigilance against the natural human tendency to conform to social expectations. Yet this is precisely where acting from duty reveals its transformative power. Your commitment to moral principles doesn't depend on institutional support or social recognition, it stems from your rational nature as a being capable of moral self-legislation. During my development of the critical philosophy, I realized that moral worth cannot be measured by external success because such success depends on factors beyond individual control. The person of good will act from respect for moral law itself, not from calculation of personal advantage. This respect, acton, constitutes a unique kind of motivation that distinguishes moral action from all other forms of human behavior. In corrupt systems, this means your ethical choices gain their significance from their rational structure, not from their reception by others. The whistleblower who reports misconduct knowing that retaliation is certain acts from duty when motivated by respect for truth and justice as universal principles. The outcome, whether the corruption is actually addressed or the whistleblower suffers persecution, doesn't determine the moral worth of the action. This perspective provides remarkable freedom in corrupt environments. You're no longer trapped in the impossible task of controlling others' responses or ensuring fair outcomes. Instead, you focus on what's genuinely within your power, the maxim from which you act. When you choose principles you could will to be universal laws, you exercise genuine autonomy regardless of external circumstances. Consider the judge who refuses bribes in a legal system where corruption is endemic. Her colleagues may prosper through dishonest practices while she struggles financially. Yet her moral worth lies not in reforming the entire system single-handedly but in consistently acting from the principle that judicial decisions should be based on law and evidence rather than personal gain. She exercises what makes her distinctively human, the capacity to act from rational duty rather than mere inclination. This analysis reveals why corrupt systems cannot ultimately undermine human dignity. Others may control rewards and punishments, but they cannot control your moral agency unless you voluntarily surrender it. Your capacity to act from duty remains intact regardless of their choices, and your exercise of this capacity contributes to the moral reality that makes human dignity possible. The practical implications extend to every professional and personal context. The teacher who maintains academic standards despite pressure to inflate grades acts from duty when motivated by respect for education as a universal good. The business owner who refuses to exploit workers despite competitive pressure exercises moral autonomy through commitment to principles she could will to govern all employment relationships. Chapter 3: Treating Humanity as an End when Others Use People as Means. In corrupt systems, people typically abandon the fundamental principle of human dignity, treating others merely as instruments for personal advancement. This creates environments where exploitation becomes normalized, superiors manipulate subordinates, colleagues betray confidences for advantage, and institutions sacrifice individual welfare for organizational benefit. Your ethical challenge isn't simply to avoid participating in such exploitation but to actively treat everyone involved as beings possessing inherent dignity. Take a moment to examine how you interact with those who've chosen corruption. Do you treat the cheating colleague merely as an obstacle to your success, or do you recognize their rational capacity for moral improvement? Do you view corrupt superiors simply as threats to be navigated, or as human beings who've temporarily abandoned their moral autonomy? The categorical imperative demands that you respect the humanity even in those who currently disrespect it in themselves and others. This doesn't mean naive trust or failure to protect yourself from harm. Rather, it means recognizing that every person possesses rational capacity for moral action, even when they're currently exercising that capacity poorly. You can implement appropriate safeguards while still treating colleagues as ends in themselves rather than merely as problems to be solved or enemies to be defeated. Consider the manager who discovers widespread expense account fraud among staff. Treating people as ends requires addressing the misconduct through fair procedures that respect their dignity while protecting organizational integrity. This might mean providing opportunities for voluntary disclosure, ensuring due process in investigations, and implementing systemic changes that support honest behavior rather than simply punishing individuals who responded to corrupt incentives. Your commitment to human dignity extends to yourself as well. When you maintain ethical standards despite others' corruption, you affirm your own rational nature and refuse to reduce yourself to merely another instrument in a corrupt system. You exercise what makes you distinctively human, the capacity to act according to universal principles rather than mere calculation of personal advantage. The formula of humanity: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means, becomes especially challenging in corrupt environments because such systems typically reduce human relationships to purely instrumental calculations. People become valuable only for what they can provide: information, access, protection, or advancement opportunities. During my years developing the moral philosophy that would become the foundation for human rights, I recognized that treating people as ends requires acknowledging their capacity for rational autonomy. This doesn't mean assuming everyone will exercise this capacity well, but rather respecting the dignity that makes moral improvement possible. Even those currently engaged in corruption retain their essential nature as rational beings capable of moral self-legislation. In practice, this means communicating with corrupt colleagues in ways that appeal to their rational capacity rather than simply their self-interest. Instead of saying, "You'll get caught if you continue cheating," you might say, "This behavior contradicts the principles that make our profession meaningful." You address them as moral agents capable of recognizing and responding to rational arguments. The principle also governs how you respond to institutional pressure to compromise your integrity. When supervisors demand participation in unethical practices, you can refuse while still treating them as ends in themselves. This might involve explaining your position in terms of universal principles rather than personal preferences, offering alternative approaches that achieve legitimate organizational goals without ethical compromise, or accepting consequences while maintaining respectful communication. Consider the healthcare worker in a system where patients are routinely overcharged or undertreated for profit. Treating humanity as an end requires not only refusing to participate in such exploitation but also advocating for patients as rational beings deserving honest information about their care. This might involve transparent communication about treatment options, supporting patients' autonomous decision-making, and working within the system to protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation. The principle extends to how you handle information obtained through your position. Even when others freely share confidential information or trade gossip for advantage, treating people as ends means respecting their privacy and dignity. You don't use personal information merely as leverage for your own advancement, even when such use might help you compete with corrupt colleagues. This approach often proves more effective than instrumental strategies because it appeals to what remains morally healthy in corrupt systems. When you consistently treat others with dignity while maintaining your own integrity, you create examples of principled behavior that can inspire moral improvement in colleagues who haven't completely abandoned their rational nature. Chapter 4: Goodwill versus Favorable Outcomes in Unjust Systems. The foundation of moral worth lies in goodwill, the disposition to act from duty regardless of external results. This principle becomes especially challenging when corrupt systems consistently reward bad behavior and punish ethical conduct. You might wonder whether maintaining goodwill is simply self-destructive idealism when surrounded by those who achieve success through moral shortcuts. Understanding goodwill requires recognizing its independence from consequences beyond your control. Your moral worth doesn't depend on whether the corrupt system recognizes your integrity, promotes you fairly, or provides equal opportunities. These outcomes, while naturally desired, are contingent on factors beyond your rational control, the choices of others, institutional structures, and circumstances that no individual can fully determine. What remains entirely within your control is your commitment to acting from universal principles rather than mere inclination or strategic calculation. When you refuse to participate in corruption, you demonstrate goodwill regardless of whether this choice leads to professional advancement, social acceptance, or material success. The moral worth of your actions stems from your rational commitment to duty, not from its reception in a corrupt environment. Consider the public servant who refuses to accept bribes while colleagues enrich themselves through corruption. Her goodwill doesn't depend on whether honest governance ultimately prevails, whether citizens recognize her integrity, or whether she achieves career advancement. The moral worth lies in her consistent commitment to serving the public good according to principles she could will to be universal laws. This perspective provides tremendous freedom in corrupt environments. You're no longer trapped in the impossible task of controlling others' choices or reforming entire systems single-handedly. Instead, you focus on what's genuinely within your power, exercising rational autonomy through consistent commitment to moral principles. Paradoxically, this often proves more effective at creating positive change than strategic accommodation to corruption, because it demonstrates the possibility of principled action and often inspires others to examine their own moral choices. The distinction between goodwill and favorable outcomes becomes particularly acute when you witness immediate harm resulting from your ethical choices. The engineer who refuses to approve unsafe designs might see projects delayed while competitors using lower standards advance more quickly. The journalist who verifies sources thoroughly might publish fewer stories than colleagues who rely on unconfirmed information. These situations test whether your commitment to moral principles depends on seeing immediate positive results. During my reflection on what makes actions morally worthy, I realized that goodwill must be unconditional to be truly moral. If your integrity depends on receiving fair treatment in return, then you're not really acting from moral duty but from a kind of ethical contract that becomes void when others breach their obligations. True moral action stems from respect for the dignity of rational nature itself, not from expectation of reciprocal treatment. This doesn't mean becoming passive in the face of injustice or accepting all outcomes with resignation. Rather, It means grounding your response to injustice in moral principles rather than mere resentment or strategic calculation. The person of good will oppose corruption not because it personally disadvantages them but because it violates universal principles of human dignity and rational cooperation. Consider the teacher in a school where great inflation is expected to maintain enrollment and funding. Acting from good will means maintaining academic standards not to personally benefit from reputation for rigor but from recognition that honest evaluation serves students' long-term development and preserves the integrity of education itself. Whether individual students appreciate this approach or whether the administration supports it doesn't determine the moral worth of her action. Good will also requires examining your own motivations when making ethical choices in corrupt environments. Are you maintaining integrity from genuine respect for moral law, or from pride, stubbornness, or desire to feel superior to corrupt colleagues? The person of good will act from duty rather than from any inclination, even positive inclinations like the desire to be seen as virtuous. This self-examination reveals the purity that distinguishes moral motivation from other forms of determination. When you act from goodwill, you're not trying to impress others, avoid guilt, maintain self-image, or achieve any particular outcome. You act from recognition that moral law deserves respect simply because it represents the rational structure that makes genuine human community possible. The practical implications extend to how you respond when corrupt systems do occasionally provide rewards for ethical behavior. If you maintain integrity only when it's recognized and rewarded, then you're not really acting from goodwill but from enlightened self-interest. True moral worth appears most clearly when you continue acting ethically despite personal cost and social disapproval. Chapter 5: Moral Freedom in Deterministic Corrupt Systems. The apparent conflict between moral responsibility and causal determinism becomes especially acute in corrupt environments. You might feel that systemic corruption creates such powerful incentives for dishonest behavior that individual moral choice becomes meaningless. If everyone cheats because the system rewards cheating, can we really speak of moral freedom and responsibility? This challenge requires understanding the distinction between the sensible world of empirical causation and the intelligible world of moral agency. In the sensible world, corrupt systems do indeed create powerful causal pressures toward dishonest behavior. Economic incentives, social pressures, institutional structures, and psychological factors all influence human action according to natural laws of cause and effect. Yet as rational beings, you also belong to the intelligible world where moral laws operate independently of empirical circumstances. Your capacity for moral action doesn't depend on favorable external conditions but on your rational nature as a being capable of acting according to universal principles. This isn't metaphysical speculation but practical recognition of something you experience directly, the ability to act against inclination when duty requires it. Reflect on your own experience of moral choice in corrupt environments. When you decide to maintain integrity despite personal cost, you exercise a kind of causation that transcends mere response to environmental pressures. You act as a free agent imposing moral order on circumstances rather than simply being determined by them. This moral freedom carries profound implications for responsibility. You cannot excuse participation in corruption by citing systemic pressures, nor can you claim that individual ethical action is meaningless in corrupt systems. Your moral choices matter precisely because they represent genuine freedom to act according to rational principles regardless of empirical circumstances. Each act of integrity demonstrates human capacity to transcend causal determination through moral self-legislation. The corrupt may appear to control the system, but they cannot control your moral agency unless you surrender it voluntarily. Your freedom to act ethically remains intact regardless of their choices, and your exercise of this freedom contributes to the moral reality that makes human dignity and social progress possible. During my critical period, I discovered that moral freedom doesn't require exemption from natural causation but rather the capacity to act according to principles that transcend empirical determination. When you choose to maintain honesty in a corrupt environment, you don't violate natural laws but exercise a form of causation that originates in rational will rather than natural inclination. This distinction becomes crucial when analyzing complex corrupt systems. Consider the pharmaceutical company where researchers face pressure to suppress negative findings about drug safety. The empirical pressures toward compliance are enormous: job security, career advancement, social acceptance, and institutional loyalty all favor participation in the cover-up. From the perspective of natural causation, honest disclosure seems almost impossible. Yet as rational beings, these researchers retain the capacity to act according to universal moral principles rather than empirical pressures. The researcher who chooses to report safety concerns exercises moral freedom by acting from duty rather than inclination. She demonstrates that human beings are not merely products of their environment but agents capable of imposing moral order on circumstances through rational choice. This freedom carries corresponding responsibility. The researcher cannot claim that systemic pressures made ethical action impossible, because her rational capacity for moral choice remains intact regardless of external circumstances. She bears moral responsibility for her choices not because the empirical situation makes ethical action easy but because her rational nature makes it possible. The analysis extends to broader questions about social change and individual agency. In corrupt political systems, citizens often feel that their individual choices don't matter because systemic problems require collective solutions. While this may be true from the perspective of empirical causation, it misses the moral significance of individual action. When you vote according to principle rather than strategic calculation, maintain honesty in corrupt institutions, or refuse to participate in exploitation, you exercise moral freedom that contributes to the intelligible world of rational action. Your choice may not immediately transform empirical circumstances, but it demonstrates and reinforces the moral reality that makes human dignity possible. This perspective also addresses the question of moral education in corrupt environments. How can we teach ethical behavior when students see corruption rewarded and integrity punished? The answer lies in recognizing that moral education appeals to rational capacity rather than empirical observation. Students can learn to act from duty regardless of what they observe about consequences in corrupt systems. The freedom to act morally thus represents both human dignity and human responsibility. You are dignified precisely because you can transcend causal determination through rational choice. But you are also responsible because this capacity makes moral action always possible regardless of circumstances. Chapter 6: Practical Reason and Hope in Seemingly Hopeless Situations. When surrounded by corruption that appears to triumph consistently, you might question whether moral effort serves any ultimate purpose. If honest people suffer while the corrupt prosper, and if systemic change seems impossible, what rational foundation exists for continued ethical commitment? This challenge leads to the postulates of practical reason that make moral life coherent even in seemingly hopeless circumstances. Practical reason demands that you act as if moral effort ultimately serves a purpose, even when empirical evidence suggests otherwise. This isn't blind faith but rational necessity. Moral action presupposes that virtue and appropriate happiness can ultimately be united, that moral progress is possible, and that rational principles can govern human affairs. Without these presuppositions, the moral life would become incoherent self-contradiction. Consider the whistleblower who exposes corruption knowing that personal retaliation is certain while systemic change remains unlikely. Practical reason supports her action not because immediate success is guaranteed but because moral progress requires individuals willing to act on principle despite uncertain outcomes. Her courage creates possibilities for future reform that wouldn't exist if everyone surrendered to apparent hopelessness. This hope differs fundamentally from mere optimism or wishful thinking. It's rational hope grounded in the structure of moral reasoning itself. Because you can act according to universal principles, because human dignity demands respect regardless of circumstances, and because rational beings possess capacity for moral improvement, you have sufficient foundation for sustained ethical commitment even in corrupt environments. The postulate of ultimate justice doesn't require belief in supernatural intervention but recognition that moral action creates its own form of meaning and value independent of empirical outcomes. When you maintain integrity in corrupt systems, you participate in what makes human life distinctively valuable, the capacity to act according to rational principles rather than mere inclination or circumstance. Your ethical commitment in corrupt environments serves the highest good by demonstrating human capacity for moral action and creating examples that can inspire others to examine their own choices. This hope sustains moral effort not through guarantee of favorable outcomes but through recognition that such effort expresses what's most essential about human rational nature. The development of practical reason during my critical period revealed that moral action necessarily involves hope for conditions under which virtue and happiness can be appropriately united. This doesn't mean expecting immediate rewards for ethical behavior but recognizing that moral effort contributes to possibilities for human flourishing that transcend current corrupt circumstances. Consider the educator working in a system where academic integrity has largely collapsed. Students cheat routinely, administrators pressure teachers to ignore misconduct, and honest evaluation seems to disadvantage students compared to those from schools with lower standards. The empirical situation appears hopeless for anyone committed to educational integrity. Yet practical reason provides foundation for continued commitment to honest education. The teacher acts from hope that learning and character development serve ultimate human good, even when immediate evidence suggests otherwise. Her commitment to academic standards contributes to possibilities for genuine education that wouldn't exist if all educators abandoned integrity. This hope extends to broader social and political contexts. Citizens in corrupt political systems might wonder whether democratic participation serves any purpose when elections seem determined by money and manipulation rather than rational discourse. Yet practical reason supports continued civic engagement from hope that rational principles can ultimately govern human affairs. The person who votes according to principle, supports honest candidates, and engages in thoughtful political discourse acts from rational hope that democratic institutions can serve human dignity even when current evidence suggests their corruption. This hope doesn't guarantee immediate political reform but sustains the moral effort necessary for such reform to remain possible. Professional contexts present similar challenges and opportunities for rational hope. The business professional who maintains ethical standards in corrupt industries acts from hope that commerce can serve genuine human needs rather than mere exploitation. The lawyer who upholds professional ethics in compromised legal systems demonstrates hope that law can serve justice rather than power. This hope also governs personal relationships in corrupt environments. When colleagues, friends, or family members choose corrupt practices, maintaining ethical standards while preserving relationships requires hope that people retain capacity for moral improvement even when currently exercising it poorly. The rational foundation for such hope lies not in empirical evidence about human behavior but in the structure of practical reason itself. Because moral improvement remains possible for rational beings, because dignity deserves respect regardless of current choices, and because principled action creates examples that can inspire others, you have sufficient reason for continued moral effort even in apparently hopeless circumstances. Chapter 7: Contemporary Applications: Integrity in Modern Corrupt Systems. American society today presents numerous contexts where individuals face the challenge of maintaining ethical standards while surrounded by systematic corruption. From corporate environments where fraudulent practices become normalized to political systems where dishonesty seems required for success, contemporary citizens must navigate complex moral terrain using the principles we've established. In the business world, consider employees in companies where unsafe products are knowingly sold, where environmental regulations are systematically violated, or where financial data is routinely manipulated. The categorical imperative provides clear guidance. You cannot will that everyone in your position participate in such deception without destroying the rational foundations that make business relationships and consumer trust possible. Acting from duty means refusing participation regardless of career consequences. Academic institutions present similar challenges when grade inflation, research misconduct, or admissions fraud becomes widespread. Students and faculty who maintain integrity while others gain advantages through cheating demonstrate the possibility of principled action in corrupt systems. Their commitment to honest inquiry preserves the rational foundations that make educational achievement meaningful. Political participation offers perhaps the most complex applications. Citizens face choices about supporting candidates who employ dishonest tactics but advance preferred policies, or maintaining principles of truthfulness and respect for democratic processes. The categorical imperative suggests focusing on the character of political action itself rather than only its results. You cannot will that everyone support dishonest candidates without undermining democratic institutions. Digital technology creates new forms of moral challenge as surveillance capitalism, data manipulation, and algorithmic bias become normalized. The principle of treating humanity as an end provides guidance for individuals working in tech companies, using social media platforms, or participating in digital marketplaces. Each choice to respect privacy, maintain transparency, or resist manipulation affirms human dignity in technological contexts. Professional ethics across fields, healthcare, law, journalism, engineering, requires constant application of universal principles despite systemic pressures toward corruption. The medical professional who refuses to participate in insurance fraud, the lawyer who maintains client confidentiality despite pressure, and the journalist who reports truthfully despite political pressure all demonstrate how Kantian principles guide ethical action in contemporary corrupt systems. The financial sector presents particularly complex challenges where the line between legitimate profit and exploitation often becomes blurred. Consider the investment advisor who discovers that recommended products primarily benefit the firm rather than clients. Treating humanity as an end requires honest disclosure about conflicts of interest and commitment to client welfare even when this reduces personal compensation. Environmental issues create urgent moral questions where individual choices interact with systemic problems. The engineer who refuses to approve environmentally destructive projects exercises moral autonomy even when such refusal seems meaningless given broader industrial practices. Her action contributes to rational foundations for environmental protection that transcend immediate practical consequences. Healthcare presents daily opportunities for applying Kantian principles in corrupt systems. When insurance companies pressure physicians to minimize care, pharmaceutical companies influence prescribing through undisclosed incentives, or hospitals prioritize profit over patient welfare, medical professionals face constant pressure to compromise patient advocacy for institutional loyalty. The physician who maintains honest communication with patients about treatment options, even when this conflicts with institutional preferences, treats humanity as an end regardless of potential career consequences. She acts from recognition that medical care serves human dignity rather than mere institutional success. Educational contexts require similar moral courage when administrators pressure teachers to inflate grades, ignore cheating, or teach to standardized tests rather than genuine learning objectives. The educator who maintains academic standards while supporting student development demonstrates how Kantian principles can guide professional practice in compromised institutional settings. Legal professionals face particular challenges in systems where justice seems secondary to wealth and political influence. The public defender who provides vigorous representation despite overwhelming caseloads and inadequate resources acts from duty to principles that make legal systems serve human dignity rather than mere power relationships. Journalism in the digital age requires constant application of truth-telling principles when pressures towards sensationalism, partisan advocacy, and clickbait content threaten professional integrity. The reporter who maintains commitment to accuracy and fairness despite competitive pressures exercises moral autonomy in service of democratic discourse. Technology workers face unprecedented moral questions about artificial intelligence, data privacy, and digital manipulation that require principled responses to corporate pressures. The programmer who refuses to implement surveillance features that violate user privacy treats humanity as an end even when such refusal might limit career advancement. These contemporary applications demonstrate that Kantian ethics provides practical guidance for navigation of complex corrupt systems while maintaining both individual integrity and commitment to human dignity. The principles don't guarantee favorable outcomes but offer rational foundation for ethical action regardless of institutional pressures or social expectations. Conclusion. Living ethically when surrounded by corruption requires understanding that moral worth lies not in achieving favorable outcomes but in consistently acting from goodwill guided by universal principles. Your commitment to integrity in corrupt systems isn't naive idealism but rational recognition of what makes you distinctively human, the capacity to act according to duty rather than mere inclination or circumstance. The categorical imperative provides unwavering guidance because it's grounded in the structure of rational agency itself, not in contingent social arrangements. When you refuse to participate in corruption, treat others with dignity despite their moral failures, and maintain hope for moral progress despite apparent futility, you exercise the freedom that constitutes human dignity. Others may control rewards and punishments, but they cannot control your moral agency unless you surrender it voluntarily. Your ethical choices matter precisely because they demonstrate human capacity to impose rational order on corrupt circumstances through principled action, contributing to the moral reality that makes genuine human community possible and preserving the foundations upon which any just society must ultimately rest.